Hey there everyone, welcome back to another look between the lines. We've been talking about the election and what's been going on, and I'm sure you've seen it everywhere on the news, but it's good to understand what is actually going on, how our elections are structured, how they've been structured, and kind of all the components that go into it, and that's what this video is going to be looking at today. Now, ever since our country was founded several hundred years ago, on July 4th, 1776, that was the day that we declared independence from Great Britain and formed the first 13 states of the United States of America. Now, back then, we came from a monarchical system, and of course, George Washington was a great leader that the people wanted to step up as our new king. But he chose instead to lead us down a different path in which there would be a democracy, a way of choosing by the people rather than bloodlines, rather than birthright, and that was the beginning to what we have today. Now, we've gone through a lot of different changes since then, from the very first election and how it was structured, and that's what I wanted to talk about today because there's a lot that is taken for granted, and not everyone kind of understands our system and what goes into it. Now, the first thing is, what is the eligibility of an individual? That's something that's set out in the Constitution but regulated with each state's level. The Constitution states that suffrage, or the right to vote, cannot be denied based on your race, your color, sex, or age as long as you are 18 years or older. Now, this is a relatively new concept because voter suppression and disallowing people's rights to vote was something that was common until these rights were passed. And one of the biggest, most recent laws was the Voting Rights Act that was passed in 1965 by Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, what that did, it finally discriminated the southern states' traditionally discriminatory practices that kept minorities and marginalized groups from being able to vote. Nowadays, that's thankfully not an issue other than other attempts of voter suppression that comes up and is still being investigated and fought against by civil rights groups to make sure that everyone can have their voice heard. It's not perfect yet, but that's why we need to keep on bringing it up, talking about it, and looking into what's going on. Another issue that's widely debated is the fact that if you are a convicted felon, you cannot vote. And while that is a state-specific rule, across the United States there are 5.3 million convicted felons that don't have the right to vote. And while this is state regulated, that's a big issue of what's going on with our justice system, which we will talk about in other videos on what needs to be done to allow more reform rather than control, and what leads to suppression due to the marginalized groups and how they're impacted by our current justice system. However, right now we're talking about the election cycle, and so that brings us to the equipment and the kind of setup that we use to be able to count so many votes. Right now in the United States, there's more than 300 million people, of which almost 150 million people are registered to vote. That is a lot of voices that need to be tracked to make sure that everything is kept fair and honest while we're trying to make sure that our highest powers, the leaders of our government and the writers of our law, are picked by the people and picked fairly. Now, early on, this was done by using paper ballots, and they were hand-counted, handwritten. For better or worse, by the late 1800s, that was the standard and everyone used that. Now, of course, as technology progressed, we came into more efficient means to keep track of the ever-increasing population, number of states and counties that were casting their voices and needed to be tracked all the same. And so, utilizing technology, we went from hand-counted paper ballots to the lever machine to punch cards, optical scans, and more recently, the direct recording electronic. Now, originally, as we said, the hand-counted paper ballots were what people use, and so almost everyone used them. Nowadays, there's a bit more of a spread depending on where you are and what you vote with. While the punch card is pretty negligible, the optical scan is being used by almost 60% of voters as of 2008, with the DRE, or the direct recording electronic, around 40%. Now, this is used for all of our elections, and that goes from the local level, your local state governors, your sheriffs, all the way up through the state and to the federal level. Now, the biggest focus, especially nowadays, is the presidential election. And a lot of that falls because the president is only one seat. While it has a vice president, the executive branch primarily falls on the shoulders of the elected president for their full 4-year term, or 8 years if they get reelected. Beyond the president, you have the congressional election, and Congress itself has two chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The Senate has 100 members, 2 from each state, and 1/3 of the Senate is elected every 2 years. The House of Representatives, however, has 435 members, and that is elected on 2-year terms every 2 years. So that means while the Senate goes through 1/3 of their seats going up for vote every 2 years, the House has every single one of their seats for vote every 2 years. Now, the thing about Congress, as opposed to the president, there are no term limits, and that's something that is debated, but right now, what that means is you can have a senator win their seat every 6 years when their term comes up, and continue to do so for as long as they are able to serve. As I said, it's widely debated about the difference in term limits, but there's a reason for that. The Senate only goes through 1/3 of their seats every 2 years to make sure that shifting political passions of the American people don't drastically impact law or let people slide in to make drastic changes. Now, the House of Representatives is a bit more chaotic in the fact that every single seat is up for grabs, and they come from their individual districts that they represent. And this culminates to the one person that sits in the executive branch, the United States President. And as we've seen for the past 4 years, the President has a lot of power to influence the people based on their own personal whims. And what this can mean, and again, we have been seeing this for the past 4 years, their opinions can drive their own policies through executive orders and influences on how they impact law. They don't need to convene with Congress. They don't need to sit with other senators. They can make their own opinions based on what they think is best with their advisors. The fact that they have advisors emphasizes they are above the Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. military, and the FBI. And that means that the executive branch all falls under the president, or at least gives the president the ability to influence our international relations, our borders, and how we handle our internal affairs. This is why having a president that is divisive can create such chaos, can create such unrest, and a lot of tension between not only our people, but the rest of the world. It does, however, counterbalance itself in the fact that President-elect Joe Biden has promised to use that same authority to upheave some of the more divisive policies of past President Trump. And that's part of the bipartisan system that we have. If someone implements policies that a party doesn't like, or the next president doesn't like, they can utilize executive orders to undo that. And again, that is what President-elect Joe Biden has promised to do to try and reunite the American people. Moving on from that, the vice president and the president run together in the presidential election. However, that's not how it used to be. Originally, the runner-up would have been the vice president, which means it would be President Joe Biden with Vice President Trump. Unfortunately, that's an old law that was ratified back in 1804, corrected with the 12th Amendment to what it is today. Now, the president runs with the vice president, and generally they share the same policies, stances, and other ideals of the parties that elected them. What this allows is for the vice president to step up if something were to happen to the president, whether, God forbid, something were to happen physically, mentally, or otherwise that imposes the president to not be able to serve us. The vice president can then step up and serve, honoring the same traditions and values that got them into the office in the first place. So, the final responsibility of the president is to appoint Supreme Court justices if there is an opening. This does, however, mean the president does not have the right to extend the number of Supreme Court justices, but to only fill a vacancy by appointing someone should there be one. So after the new justice is nominated, the nominee goes before Congress to have their hearings to make sure that they are going to serve the country honorably and within the bounds of the judicial branch. The judicial branch's entire role revolves around the judicial process, as it would sound. Review cases and make decisions based on what comes up and is escalated to them, usually from the state level or big federal issues. And that is their role, to make sure that everything is interpreted and sound as the highest court authority within our nation. So with that, we have gone over all 3 branches of government and our election history and process of how those pieces of government come together and into their power. Now, the powers they have are all laid out in the Constitution. What the Constitution does is it lays out the powers of the government and the rights of the people therein. Any power that's not given to the federal government in the Constitution is explicitly reserved for states, which has created some fortunate moments in history regarding segregation, sexuality laws, or the rights to get married for same sex couples or trans people. And while this has been something that's come up in more recent years, it hasn't been something that people have had the right to express themselves through for quite a while. And that's something that we're also talking about what's going on in the world today, why it's coming to light, and why it's such a good thing that we're starting to see people as people and give them respect regardless of what's going on behind the scenes. There are still a lot of very archaic laws and rules in this country, and while we don't hear about them, they are still in existence in our law books, in our history, in our very culture, and that's something that needs to change. That's why we need to speak up. We need to keep on making our voices heard, and we need to make sure that we are electing people who want to get us to the next stage, to keep on looking forward and again pushing for the future beyond what you hear on TV, beyond what you see on the news. We need to get beyond where we are as human beings and as fellow Americans. With that said, leave a comment below. Tell me what you think about this. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what's going on, what you think about our election system, and what needs to change with our existing laws and what needs to come up with new ones. And of course, don't forget to leave a like and hit that subscribe button so you can see when we come out with new content as we continue to talk about the situations that come up in our country and what has happened and what we need to do. Thank you all for coming, and we'll see you again for another look between the lines.